So pressure's on.
The pressure is on. Okay. Well, today we have Dr. Jonathan Rutledge from the Logos Institutes for Analytic and Exegetical Theology. And Jonathan, I'm going to read a little snippet from the bio I found at St. Andrews.
Cool.
It makes it sound more official if I do that. So Jonathan previously received a PhD from the University of Oklahoma, where he specialized in epistemology and philosophy of religion. And he has particular interest in theories of epistemic rationality that fall within a tradition inspired by Richard Foley, especially in applying such theories to the debate concerning skeptical theism as a response to the problem of suffering. That sounds interesting. Maybe we should talk about that some other day. And then I know that you also recently completed a second PhD at St. Andrews. That's correct? Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
In divinity. Mm-hmm. So he's a glutton for punishment. I don't know how you did that, buddy. I just finished my PhD and I'm like, nope, that's it.
Yeah. Well, it helps when you have people like Alan and Andrew Torrance around, and now Oliver Crisp, right? They can inspire you to trudge on through all of the difficulties and such. So.
Well, you need a cheerleading team for sure. So I'm not going to read out your whole bio. Jonathan's published a lot of really interesting articles, and do you want to say anything? What are you currently working on? Do you have any projects?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, I do. Right now, I'm finishing a book on forgiveness and atonement. So basically, I'm working through so issues of restorative versus retributive justice and how to take the notion of sacrifice in Scripture seriously. So there are just a lot of things that go on there, and then a particular definition of forgiveness that I defend. So that's my biggest current project. I've also got some side stuff that I'm working on. I'm editing a new series with Josh Cockane, one of my good friends and colleagues here, called Analyzing Theology, and I don't know, other stuff. But yeah, in short, that's what I'm working on.
That's awesome. Yeah, I saw that you were editing that volume. So that looks like it'll be really fun to read. I'll just say just a brief personal note. I met Jonathan, I think it was like 2017, maybe. I may be wrong.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a conference. This is going to sound really pretentious, but I met him at Cambridge, and it was really cool. I think we hung out for just a little bit after one of the talks and chatted a bit about something theological, I'm sure. And yeah, so I've just stayed in touch through Facebook. So thank you very much for agreeing to join me today.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about this, and thanks everyone for coming and joining. And Jason, I see that you've joined too. So just a shout out to you. He's one of our PhD students here, Jason Stegall. Be on the lookout for the new faith stuff that he'll be doing. But anyway.
Ooh, yes, nice. Well, maybe Jason will have you on another time. That'd be wonderful. So today we're talking about original sin and whether or not it entails that you can't trust your cognitive faculties. Before we dive into that, as we just mentioned, Jonathan specializes in analytic theology. So could you say a word about that? I mean,
yeah, so analytic theology, I mean, there are different ways to answer this. So the short version of that is, and I think, Josh, we just lost you a little bit, but I'm just going to carry through with answering the question anyway. Does everyone else hear me okay?
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Yeah, so there are different ways to do this. The short version is that analytic theology is theology that's informed by the tools and methods of analytic philosophy. Which is only helpful for anyone that knows what the tools and methods of analytic philosophy are, and for anyone that knows what theology is. So sometimes it's better just to say that theology is the study of God in all things in relation to God. And the way that I try to deal with that, it basically means that if there is no God, if atheism were true, then theology is not really a thing that we practice. Because like any science, you have to be able to study the object of the science. If the object's not there, if you're studying the ether or something, then you're not really studying that object, right? So that's theology. It's the study of God and everything in relation to God. But then the analytic side of that is the analytic philosophy side. So roughly, just to say briefly what the analytic philosophy methods and tools are supposed to be, it's something like laying bare the assumptions with which you're working in any given argument, trying to ensure that the logical form of your argument is clear from the beginning, giving lots of propositions and clear premises in that argument. And then also aiming at coherence and concision. And it's a particular way, right, of writing and proceeding that makes use of logical symbols often, or can at least, and just attends almost to a wild level for the details of precision, right? So that's a really, really short intro to here's what analytic philosophy is, which is also not really monolithic, even though I'm pretending that it is for the sake of answering the question. So.
No, excellent. That's a fantastic answer. Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. We get used to using some of this jargon because we're all, those of us who are in academia, and we need to remember that, the everyday person who's not always sticking their head in books, reading all this technical stuff, they may not know what you mean by analytic theology. So that was a really good breakdown. Let's dive into the topic. And the talk today is based off of an article that Jonathan published, and I will provide links for that when I post the YouTube video, so you can check out his article to get the full argument. In your article, you talk about this common methodology known as reflective equilibrium, and that plays a big role in the discussion about original sin and your cognitive faculties in your paper. So could you give us just a breakdown of what you mean by reflective equilibrium?
Sure. If it's okay, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit from that and then come back into it. So it's helpful to keep in mind that, so the general argument that I'm giving in this paper is that you can trust your cognitive faculties in the face of an extremely interpreted worst case scenario understanding of the doctrine of original sin, right? But it helps to have in view when you're thinking about whether or not you can trust your faculties, like the ways in which you form beliefs and look at evidence and that sort of thing. It helps to have in mind or in view an actual method by which people come to beliefs and form those beliefs. So for the sake of the argument, I went ahead and introduced this reflective equilibrium that you mentioned. And you get this in John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. He uses this method or talks about it a bit, and then you find it elsewhere. It's really fairly commonplace. The general idea is something like this. So all of us have theories about various things, right? You might have a theory about motion in physics. You might have a theory about whether or not the baseball player, the batter, is able to hit changeups or fastballs. And then you also have intuitions and data, right, that you have to take in. And your theory is supposed to accommodate the data. And sometimes the theory and the data don't mix, right? So sometimes you throw a changeup because you think the batter's not going to be able to hit changeups. And then after maybe 2 or 3 rounds with the batter, you realize that maybe your theory was wrong because they keep hitting home runs off of you or something like that. Well, reflective equilibrium is this process that we engage with, which even a pitcher in a baseball game like that would be going through, right? They're trying to determine, okay, did the hit that the batter got, is that hit evidence in my theory that they're not good at hitting changeups is wrong? Or is it just that they got lucky this one time or so on? So they're constantly deciding, should I change my approach, or should I take that or should I take this to just be an aberration of what the theory predicts? So to take this out of baseball and put it into more philosophy. So in ethics, right, we go around the world, we try to decide how we're going to act. And sometimes you might have a theory that's fairly familiar. So suppose you're a utilitarian. And the utilitarian theory that I'm going with is a very just stereotypical one, that you should act in such a way as to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of people across the board, or greatest happiness, right? You have to work out what good is. And for some utilitarians, it might be pleasure. But suppose you currently hold to this sort of basic utilitarianism, right? And then suppose that you realize that there's a situation before you, and if you frame an innocent person for a crime, then that's going to result in the best overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So according to your theory of utilitarianism, you have an obligation, actually, to frame this person for a crime. So suppose you hold to utilitarianism loosely because you've got previous cases where you spent too much time with Peter Singer or someone else, and they've talked you into it, but they haven't talked to you too much. So you look at this case, you realize that the theory says frame the innocent person for a crime, and you think that can't be right? You have this intuition that conflicts immediately with the theory. So what are you supposed to do? You have to sort between either following through with the theory and, in fact, framing an innocent individual, or altering your theory in virtue of the intuitions, right? So reflective equilibrium then is this. It's a process of modifying one's intuitions and one's theories in light of each other, such that one's able to arrive at some degree of coherence between them over time. So it doesn't prioritize the theory and give the theory in principle trumping power, and it doesn't prioritize the intuitions and give them trumping power either. It's a sort of combination of both. It's a very natural way, like I said earlier, to proceed. So that's putting some sort of theoretical spin on what is a very natural way to reason with theories and intuitions. So how's that?
That's brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for that. So as we discuss this, I think it'll become more clear why it's important for you to set that up and to talk about that. I guess this leads kind of naturally into the next question is, when we talk about the fall and original sin, I think a lot of people, probably most people watching this, will be familiar with those concepts. You might want to say maybe just a few words about it, what the fall is, what the original sin means, but also why would someone think that the fall and original sin would entail that you can't trust your cognitive faculties? Maybe you could give even like a real life example, like some interaction you've had, a discussion.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, so I have students, friends, colleagues here who I was engaging with when I was writing this paper, who in fact held to this view. They thought that, you shouldn't trust your faculties in virtue of the fact that original sin is utterly and completely annihilating of the human person. So sin is so infested who we are. In fact, there's a point in Lutheran history, right, where there was a debate on how we should understand what original sin is. And the debate was over whether or not it was a substance or an accident. Does human nature just become sin as substance? And Lutheranism went to say, no, that's not going to work. That's heretical. So you can go read the Lutheran confessions and stuff like that to find that. But it's something which has sort of persisted in various guises a lot throughout Christian tradition, this notion that sin so affects who we are as humans that it might even change our very substance, which to a philosopher that might sound like very problematic. But anyway, so that's one reason. There are people who actually believe this, right? And so you want to be able to talk with them and help them come to a place where they realize you don't have to go that far. Another reason you might think about it, which is connected to this, is theological motivation to avoid Pelagianism, right? So Pelagianism is the view that basically, well, and this is technically like a semi-Pelagianism, but that the beginnings of our salvation can be started by us and not by God, right? So the desire to have faith might be something that we start, right? And so long as the beginnings of a desire is within us, then God will imbue us with faith, some sort of belief in him or whatever that's going to be. If you hold to that sort of view, that's specifically a view which is condemned at Orange, where you have semi-Pelagianism and Pelagianism in view. So someone might think something like this, that no possible good can come from me in virtue of being a sinner. And then trusting my reason, right? That looks like I'm affirming that reason is a natural good that is inside of me as a human, right? And that could lead us to think that God could be found by us without some sort of additional grace. Just look to the good reason that we have within us, and then we'll be able to bring ourselves to God. So that's where this sort of incipient Pelagian worry might lie. I think it's misguided, but I understand why someone would be worried about it in broad strokes, right? There are also things like Scripture. So we are dead in our trespasses. We see now as through a glass darkly. All of those, that language at least is suggestive perhaps of some sort of epistemic problem, some sort of cognitive problem with our beliefs or the ways in which we form beliefs. And then, of course, there's Calvin. Now, I've got this quote right here, so I'll just read it straight. So Calvin says, original sin may be defined as the hereditary corruption and depravity of our nature. So I'll just go to him for original sin. That's your definition. This reaches every part of the soul, makes us abhorrent to God's wrath, and produces in us what Scripture calls works of the flesh. Our nature is not only completely empty of goodness, but so full of every kind of wrong that it's always active. Those who call it lust use an apt word, provided it is also stated that everything which is in man, from the intellect to the will, from the soul to the body, is defiled and imbued with this lust. To put it briefly, the whole man is in himself nothing but lust. So that's a fairly all-encompassing statement of what gets messed up by the fall and original sin. All X, for any X, if it's a thing, screwed up. Right, in short. So these are some inspirations in tradition, historically, debates, Calvin and the Reformed tradition, so the Lutherans, Reformed tradition, Scripture, all of these sorts of things might lead somebody to think, oh, this is a serious issue, right?
Oh, yeah. And you're absolutely right. This is actually a real, it's an issue that can come up not just among academics. I mean, this is something you're likely to encounter in your local church somewhere. Let me say something of just like a single example. So if you've ever encountered the old or the Hebrew Scriptures, right, and you read through texts which seem to say genocide has been commanded by God, you might think, so suppose that they do teach that. One thing to do is to think, well, God says genocide is okay, so maybe it's okay. He wouldn't command it if it wasn't permissible. Well, we don't want to say that. Why? Partly because we have these moral intuitions, which are very strong against genocide or against misogyny or all these various other things, right? That Scripture is one of these texts where God is teaching us through it, but precisely what God's teaching and how we get to that teaching is not entirely perspicuous, right? So it's important that we not think when we read some sort of teaching that appears to be a moral teaching, that we then have a conflict with in a reflective equilibrium way, right? That we think, oh, we need to just allow Scripture to teach us what we ought to believe despite our inner tension and dissonance that we feel with respect to it. And I see that often coming up, especially in these sorts of apologetics contexts and various other things. I think it's just wild to me that you wouldn't allow your moral intuitions and epistemic intuitions, various other things, to be actual data that might conflict with certain ways of understanding Scripture at a more theoretical level. Yeah, I mean, those are really excellent examples. I had the same thing happen to me when I did my bachelor's degree at a seminary in classroom debates and discussions. And this came up often, and I found myself, this is, I think, one of the things that piqued my interest when I saw that you'd written this article is how many times I've had that exact conversation where I've said, this doesn't sit well with me. This just seems straightforwardly wrong. And so how can we believe that? And then someone responds very similar to what you said. Well, this is just what Scripture teaches. We have to accept it. I can see other areas where you don't talk about this, I don't think, at least explicitly in your paper, but I've even had the conversations when it comes to matters of science. So, hey, here's what geologists have discovered, or astronomers, or, physicists. And someone says, well, it just seems like that the Scripture teaches the opposite, so you just can't trust that. You can't trust your reasoning, scientific reasoning in that kind of way. Thank you so much for that. So, okay. So you're focusing on Calvin. and you quoted him, and that's a really excellent quote to have drawn from, to talk about this really strong version of original sin, which the entire person is so sinful, their nature's been changed, you can't trust your reasoning, your cognitive faculties. I mean, one response to that would just be to say, yeah, well, Calvin, he's wrong. So I was just curious. So, I mean, why is it important? And you mentioned this in your paper. Why is it important to focus on this worst case scenario interpretation of the fall?
Yeah. This is a really important point. So, in fact, Calvin is, I don't know that I think Calvin holds to this view. I actually have strong reason to doubt it because of other quotes that I don't have with me. And I'm not a Calvin scholar. But he writes really well. So when he writes with passion, and so you can draw really good quotes from him as a result. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is, again, it's not actually that important that Calvin holds to this, just that there are people who do, and that you can understand Calvin reasonably, defend like this understanding of Calvin maybe at this point in his writing, at this point in his life. He did believe it, even if he goes away from it at other points in his writing. It's really important to use that at least as a sort of representation of other people who might, in fact, really hold these sorts of things. It's also nice to have your bases covered. So even if the understanding of original sin that you find in Calvin is a misunderstanding, I don't think that you can rule out this interpretation of original sin across the board, at least certainly not with any sort of certainty. Right. So original sin is one of these doctrines that is much more inchoate in Scripture. You're really not looking to Genesis for your doctrine of original sin. I know I talked through the image of God in the paper a little bit in Genesis 1 and such, but really you're looking more at Romans 5 and reception of Romans 5 in the early church, and Jewish reception and Second Temple Judaism of various themes that appear in Romans 5 that might be in the background of Paul's mind. So original sin, if you're going to find it at the time of the texts, you're going to have to look prior to the Christian tradition, right? But for the most part, it really develops with like Augustine, Irenaeus, Maximus the Confessor has some stuff, Anselm, Julian of Norwich. So those are the kinds of people that you're going to get a doctrine with. But it's a development, and what the right understanding of original sin is, like the guaranteed right understanding, is pretty controversial. So Ian McFarland has a nifty book on this in Adam's Fall that's worth looking at if you're interested. So.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, and obviously, if you're responding to the worst case scenario, then that covers anything else. I mean, if you use like a little more moderate, it still responds to that. So
yeah, that's right. So in like practical daily life, so our car is broken down and right now, and so someone might say like, well, worst case scenario, you can't fix the car and you have to sell it, right? Well, what you're saying is, well, in the worst case scenario, you'll survive. In any not as bad case scenario, you'll still survive because the worst case scenario is ruled out. So that's the sort of reasoning process that's involved in this. Yeah. Thanks for that, Josh.
Yeah, of course. All right, great. Well, so okay, we need to get in then to your response in the paper to this problem. So we've talked about the problem. I think it's one that a lot of people can relate to. So in your paper, to begin a response to it, you develop this really interesting thought experiment. So would you mind kind of taking us through that thought experiment now?
Sure. So I talk about this other person named Sally, who is one of my representative names. So I just throw Sally into various papers, but I don't know anyone that well named Sally. But I'm going to tell you a quick story about Sally. So Sally has always trusted herself generally when it comes to her intellectual activities. So she thinks that she's a reliable evidence gatherer. She's relatively good at evaluating her evidence, though not infallibly. She admits that she makes mistakes, and it's not that uncommon, but she's better than 50-50 for the most part, she would say. So she has this general trust in her abilities to do epistemic things. Called that epistemic self-trust, right? She has a robust degree of that, but not anything unreasonable. She's like an ordinary person in this respect. But so upon reading Calvin's Institutes, she comes across this passage that we've just heard, and all of a sudden she comes to believe, as a result of reading it, that there's a real possibility, there's a live, momentous possibility that her intellectual activities are in some significant way utterly and systematically unreliable due to the corruption of sin, right? So, as a result of this, she acquires a reason to doubt that her cognitive faculties are generally reliable. And this is an unfortunate thing. For now, Sally is unsure whether or not she can trust the particular deliverances of her intellectual activities in the future because she has this reason to doubt that her faculties are reliable in general. And what's worse, right, it seems that the reason Sally has for distrusting her intellectual self in general is a reason she only gains by way of an act of trusting those very cognitive capacities being called into question. That is, she gains a reason for ceasing to trust her epistemic self with an act of trusting her epistemic self. Okay? So puzzled about the implications for her cognitive life, Sally wonders, how am I ever to move forward, right? So now the question for us is, how is she supposed to move from this place? Essentially, right, she has a couple of reasons. She has this natural, pre-reflective, initial self-trust that she has. She has this epistemic self-trust. She thinks she's a reliable cognizer. And relying on that, she then acquires another reason to doubt that reason is valid, right? That there's something wrong with her pre-reflective self-trust. Well, it's not like this one automatically gets Trump value and immediately all of your pre-reflective self-trust is gone. For Kevin Nordby, who worked with Linda Zagzebski, he'll know. I've got Epistemic Authority, that book in the background here. But it's not like you should give trumping power just to this. But it's also not obvious that you should give trusting power to your pre-reflective self, at least from the beginning. So which reason's supposed to win out? What are you supposed to do? So what's Sally going to do? She's going to ascend reflectively, and she's going to essentially take a third-person view of herself and the reason that she has for distrusting her own faculties and make a further judgment about what to do. So that's the thought experiment prior to the actual argument. So do you want me to move straight into the argument?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I love thought experiments, so this is so much fun. Yeah, I mean, I guess the next question then is, how does this thought experiment, which you kind of hinted at with your awesome little pause there, and how does this demonstrate the self-undermining nature of this worst case scenario interpretation of the fall?
Yeah. So basically, once you've got the thought experiment and the person in mind who's trying to figure out what to do with these competing reasons for and against trusting herself, I construct something which is inspired by Plantinga. If you've read any of his work on classical foundationalism, so he gives a self-undermining argument, and it's structurally identical to that. And I was really excited when I was writing the paper to be able to do that, just as a little homage for myself. But anyway, here's the argument. It goes like this. So Sally's sitting here. She looks at this and she considers this argument. She says, well, look, if Calvin's understanding of original sin is correct, then my epistemic activities aren't trustworthy, right? That's just part of what it says. That's the doctrine, or his understanding anyways. And well, suppose it is correct, right? So if P then Q, P, suppose P is true. Suppose that Calvin's understanding of original sin is correct. Well, then it immediately follows that my epistemic activities and capacities and everything else, they're not trustworthy, right? But that's an argument that I just came up with in my head, which requires me to employ my cognitive faculties to follow it, right? Well, it seems like you're back at the beginning of where we were trying to sort things out. So she just asks herself, she looks at the conclusion, which says my epistemic activities are not trustworthy. And she thinks, okay, well, look, if that's true, if in fact my epistemic activities are not trustworthy, then I can't rationally endorse this argument because it relies on my epistemic activities. So if it's true, I can't rationally endorse it. So it's self-undermining in an epistemic respect. But suppose that the conclusion is false, that my epistemic activities are not trustworthy. it's false that they're not trustworthy, which means they are trustworthy, right? Well, if my epistemic faculties are trustworthy and I can follow this argument, well, it doesn't give me any reason to actually endorse the argument, right? It just shows that I can't rationally endorse it, right? It's impossible to do that. So basically what happens then is just to run through the steps one more time. So if Sally can rationally endorse the argument because she can go all the way through to the conclusion, then it follows from the conclusion that she can't rationally endorse it. And that's a contradiction. And you don't want to affirm stuff with contradictions unless you're J.C. Beale. So we can't rationally accept that. But if Sally can't rationally endorse the argument, then why is she bothering with it? Clearly, she can rationally use her faculties and not worry about the implications of Calvin's understanding of the doctrine of the fall. So that's the short sort of version of the argument. It's worth keeping in mind a few caveats of this. So a lot of people tell me like, oh, so you're saying that we can know everything about Scripture and not have to worry about original sin. The original sin doesn't undermine my knowing things. And that's not what I say, right? I am talking about rationality, and there are various epistemic goods. Knowledge is something which is factive in truth entailing, in other words. But rationality is not, right? I can rationally have false beliefs. Suppose that my son tells me he's going to bed at 6:30, and typically he's reliable in going to bed when he says he is. But this night he gets distracted by his accordion. So I form a false belief, but, it was rational, but nevertheless false. That's okay, right? So it's really important for this argument that we not try to extend it too far. And the reason why is that it's structurally identical to a more familiar case in epistemology called the new evil demon problem. And usually this is done to distinguish two types of approaches to knowledge, right? So one approach called an externalist approach says that we can know things only if we have true belief plus some sort of external external factor or constituent, which explains how it is that we know things, right? And internalists say that, well, no, we justified true belief, rational true belief from the inside is sufficient for knowledge. That's just what knowledge is. But nevertheless, we might all lack knowledge sort of radically and wildly, right? Because, and why is it that we might all lack this knowledge? Well, it might be the case that if Descartes is right, that there's this evil demon which sits in the background, unnoticed by any of us because of his incredible powers, but he continually deceives our experiences, deceives us. So he puts the world in such a way that it appears to be the way that it looks to us, but in fact, it's entirely and systematically misleading. And if that's the case, then we never know, or we never have any truth, right? And so we can never have knowledge in that world. But we might still have rationality because the people have evidence at the new evil demon world. And even if it's systematically misleading, nevertheless, it's still evidence and it connects with stuff. And it's not their fault that they're in this radically depraved world, right? So similarly, to bring us back into the original sin context, it might be the case that Calvin's doctrine of original sin is true. But if it is, it undermines knowledge, but it doesn't undermine rationality, and it doesn't undermine every single epistemic good, right? There's still positive ways of performing epistemically and cognitively that we can aim at, given that truth is sort of independent of us anyway. So, in principle.
Excellent. Brilliant. I mean, I think it's interesting how closely actually this kind of worst case scenario interpretation of the fall mirrors the kind of Cartesian skepticism that you outlined. And that kind of skepticism, it is very corrosive. I mean, once you give into a little bit of it, it just kind of eats away at all of our possibility of being rational and trusting our cognitive faculties, full stop, which is a big problem. I don't know that anyone could, I mean, there might be someone who thinks that they believe that, but I don't know that any of us actually really function that way, because we do go about our day trusting our judgments and making rational choices and decisions. And we're not always sat back going, oh, I don't even know if I can trust this.
Right. Well, the new evil demon case is helpful in various ways. At least for me, I take one of the main things that it shows is not so much that we don't know things. I think we do. But it emphasizes for me that knowledge isn't the only thing worth caring about. It's really a value issue fundamentally. And maybe if knowledge is one of these things that we can't get because truth is systematically elusive, or for some other reason you have to be an infallible person to be a knower or something like that, then okay, fine, whatever. Let's aim at these other epistemic goods which are worth our time. And they might even be things like intellectual courage or intellectual humility, right? These other epistemic virtues that come into play. And that way, even if like this radical doctrine of original sin is true, or a radical new evil demon case is true, there are still things worth pursuing, even in that context. And that I think is a really important point for this conversation, at least.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I could probably keep talking to you about this, but I think probably everyone here listening will have some kind of question to ask. So I'm going to now shift over to opening the floor up for questions. I don't really have a very good method, except for if you're really interested in asking a question, maybe just raise your hand and then you can, unmute yourself and have at it. So would anyone like to pose a question for Jonathan about any of the stuff we've been talking about so far? Don't be shy. Oh, excellent. Go ahead, Yvonne.
Well, first of all, thanks for sharing your studies and your I'm forgetting my English now, but thanks for this opportunity. It's totally related to what I've been trying to learn for a few years now. And well, basically, I do read Calvin from time to time. I do attend Presbyterian Reformed Church here in Chile. And I usually try to connect my ideas or what I know so far about Calvin with my ideas in theology, but also in philosophy. Basically, my question to you, Jonathan, thanks, would be, first of all, if you have, I guess you all have some knowledge on the topic of common grace. I know not everybody may adhere to this, and so having said that, what is, or if you have found some connection for this equilibrium that I think you are talking about, or you talked about first, what is the connection between common grace and our reliability in our way of thinking, if we consider these the effects of fallen sin in our lives, in our minds?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the question, Yvonne. That's great. That's creative and interesting. Yeah, so the doctrine of creative grace. So I imagine that one thing that a lot of people in theology would want to avoid doing would be to put a limit on the manifestations of generally this kind of grace, this common grace. So it might in fact be, right, that the minimal functionality that we see in our cognitive capacities of at least rationality, that these sorts of things are just manifestations of common grace. And I don't know how far that will reach, if the virtues themselves would count as that. I mean, the main push, right, is that you have this understanding of common grace that has to be balanced by the understanding of this radical sin nature, right? That's the question. And so it seems like this might be one of those places where the common grace component would fit in against that sort of radical sin nature, not against it, but in a complementary way. But what I worry about is that I want this to be a little bit more robust than that. So I don't, but again, I also don't want to be Pelagian. So so this is a really good question. How to work out the details. The safe thing to say is that this is a manifestation of common grace, which is given to all humans. But whether or not you can get something more robust, that's something worth thinking about. So is that good? Does that at least get at what you're thinking? Feel free to push back or suggest other stuff.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to know if that was on the right track.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
If this can help, but I'm sure there must be maybe some deeper analysis on, because I think most Christians now are only getting to know more about common grace right now after Kuyper and Babbing a few 200 years ago or something like that. So we still don't know much about it. But then there are the other implications, and I think Plantinga and people like that, they may also have something to say about it. So
yeah, definitely. Well, thanks so much for the question. Really good. It'll be something to think about going forward too. So
yeah, I mean, and it's important to note, I mean, he's in the paper, he's trying to respond to kind of focusing in on one aspect of this problem. And so there's a lot more that could be done for sure, I think, to talk about the effects of original sin, or in the Orthodox tradition, as where I come from, we talk about ancestral sin, and what that means in terms of our capacity to have knowledge or the capacity to function as rational creatures, things like that. I mean, there's a lot more that could be written on and talked about. So I think that's a really good point. Maybe drawing in this other literature talking about common grace would be a really good direction to take the next step. Fantastic. Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question or even ask for a clarification on an issue or make rude comments? No, I'm just kidding.
So I see V's hand is up, his virtual hand.
Go ahead, V.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Kevin. Because I have to go very quickly after this. But is there any application to, let's say, the social dimension when we interact with others? I mean, not necessarily related to God and other minds with Plantinga, but sure. In trusting others. I don't know what your theory is on time slices with individuals, but if that has any relation to that. But yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a hylomorphic animalist, and I'm not identical to a time slice. But anyway, that stuff aside, this is good. So in terms of trust with others, that really is for me mostly a fundamentally like epistemic issue. So I can set aside some of the metaphysics, not all, but some of it. So basically, I take it that here's a principle. This is just me parroting Linda Zagzebski. So you might think that you should treat like cases alike, right? So if you trust yourself and you see someone else who seems to be, as far as you can tell, at least as good at you at getting information and making judgments, then you should trust them, generally speaking, and trust them with the same degree of trust that you would put in yourself, more or less. And so there are like these social extensions, right? So the treat like cases alike principle would lead you to trust others. But it also might be the case that because there's this sort of fundamental egocentric predicament that I talked about in the paper briefly, it might be the case that you reasonably can distrust people who in fact are better at getting things epistemically than you, or epistemically right or socially right, however you want to spell it out. But just because you are the one who ultimately has to sort through these competing reasons for and against belief and for and against action and those sorts of things. Ultimately, it does come down to you making that decision and sorting through. And I don't actually think the rationality has to be threatened in any case. What typically is threatened is something like you might end up being epistemically arrogant because you ignore all of the people who are your peers. If you're a scientist giving a lecture at a conference and they tell you, hey, that doesn't follow you should maybe do this with your theory. And you think, oh, what idiots? Why would they question me on these things? That's epistemic arrogance, right? So even if it might be rational for you to rule out all of these people, epistemically, it fits your evidence and the way in which you think evidence connects with various other propositions that you ought to believe. That's something like what I take rationality to be. But it might be the case that you have other more important deficiencies, vices that you need to attend to. So yeah, thanks for that, V. That's a really good question as well. The social epistemology side of things is always getting more interesting for me. So. See, I think Kevin had a question before too. I'm also seeing in the chat we have a question. So Kevin, why don't you give me your question first so I can think about the chat question as well.
Sure, Jonathan. And you're welcome to ignore mine if you find the chat question more interesting.
Okay, I'll turn to the chat then. Just kidding. Go ahead. Sorry.
First things first, this was an interesting and good paper. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
And then otherwise, my Wi-Fi is poor. So if I disappear while you're responding to my question, please continue, and I'll just watch it on the recording.
Sounds good.
That happens. Don't want that to my question is on what is page 91, I believe, in the PDF, at the very end of your article. You say, in summary, the above argument can be clearly seen to be self-undermining, and I have no disagreement with this. You say, if the conclusion is true, then no one can rationally endorse the argument. Fair. And if the conclusion is false, no one should rationally endorse the argument. If the conclusion is false, I have no bone to pick there. But what if the conclusion is true? No one can do it then, and I agree with you. But you say, given those two, the best way forward for Sally is to continue trusting her epistemic self. And it's not clear to me that exhausts sort of the negative space. So if it is the case that her epistemic activities are not trustworthy, so she cannot endorse the argument, I'm not sure how we know from that position that necessarily what is now rational is to continue an epistemic self-trust. There might be more than one way to move forward from realizing your epistemic activities are not trustworthy, but your argument doing so are ones you can either. Why in the face of that should I say, oh, so now I should, because I can't really go anywhere, trust my epistemic? I think that, like, if you went a Michael Huemer kind of phenomenal conservatism way, you could do something there. And maybe you have that lurking, I don't know. Or I've missed something, which is likely. But I wanted to check and see, in the case that the conclusion is in fact true, why is it that from there I should say I should keep trusting?
Yeah, good. So what I think of as rationality fundamentally is trying to figure out what to think and what to do, right? It seems to me that if the conclusion's true, there's a problem, right? I can either cease to trust my faculties, and I'm not sure what that looks like, right? So there's a sort of practical issue in trying to figure out how to do that in the first place. And then there's also a practical issue in that it seems like because it's so hard to not trust your faculties or even imagine what that would be like, that there's this almost practical necessity to engage in trusting them, to even try and figure out, well, what ought I to think given that my faculties are unreliable? You're forced to rely on your faculties yet again. So it's more something along the lines of there's an inescapability about it, that you have to go ahead and continue, even if they are in fact unreliable. And part of it is tied up with the argument that you'll never be able to tell. And practically, if you can't reach the epistemic reasons, or not just the epistemic reasons, but the actual truths of the matter, then the best way forward is probably the one that, at least from all appearances, seems to be the one that you can do. If that makes sense. You might have third, fourth, or fifth options on ways to react. So it might be that trusting faculties is too strong, that I should say that you should use your faculties but not trust them, or something like that, right? And maybe, I'm not sure.
No, that's helpful, Jonathan. Yeah. I was thinking something about perhaps it's rational to use them, but simultaneously I might be admitting that there's an intraversible gulf between whether or not these track the truth now. So I should continue using them, but if I continue using them with also the idea that, and they're probably tracking the truth, that might be inappropriate. It might be that it's prudential or in my self-interest or rational to keep using them, but kind of how I fill that in. What am I doing when I keep using them? Perhaps there's more than one way to keep using them.
That's good. No, that's really good. I mean, I take it that at that point you're asking what to believe, not necessarily what's true. If you actually think that it's likely that you're radically deceived in these ways. But I'm okay with that, because epistemology for me isn't ultimately about truth. It's about believing well, even though it would be nice if we could get truth. But I belong into a tradition that just embraces that and copes over time. So
I like it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin.
Sure.
Brilliant question.
So,
question.
Let's see.
Jason, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Jason. Sorry, I was going back to the chat and I realized that it had been answered.
No worries.
Apparently. So.
Building off of, thanks so much for this, Jonathan. Building off of, some aspects of, I think, what Kevin was asking too. I'm curious, sort of based on this way of framing or viewing sort of the cognitive faculties that we have, going to like something like the biblical texts and Paul's epistles. What do you sort of see, or how do you understand sort of Paul's call to sort of commit yourself to the renewal of one's mind? And how does that sort of connect to, I guess, these considerations about whether or not our cognitive faculties are trustworthy?
That's good. So one thing that goes back to some of the different epistemic goods emphasis is that renewing your mind is not solely about rationality. It's also about that actually might be a little bit more about the truth, right? You might ask God to reveal truths to you that you didn't understand before, or give you the sort of character to be willing to accept them as they're given to you. So I don't know, thinking about Paul, right? The mysterion of the covenant coming to include the Gentiles, right? Here's some new knowledge which has been revealed to Paul. And it's going to take a movement of the Spirit of God to enlighten those who hear his testimony, to embrace that and take it as true. So there's an epistemic dimension to that side of Paul's ministry. But the transformation of the mind stuff, though, I think it has to be tied in with character concerns, as well as a more communal way of thinking about how it is that we gain knowledge and act in the world. To say something very broad brush that I do have views on, but you'll know your supervisor talks about these sorts of things. So Josh and I are largely on the same page there. But that the church, and coming to know what the purpose of the church is and the things that we ought to do corporately requires a dimension of reliance on the Spirit, right, to reveal those things and also to bring them about by very meticulously and in the background enabling the church to act in various ways amidst rogue agents, among other things. So something like that is what Paul probably meant. Absolutely. So
cool. Thanks. That's helpful.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason.
Fantastic. Well, I think, are there any final questions? Because I think I don't want to keep Jonathan tied up too much longer, because I'm sure he has other things he needs to get to today. Any final questions? Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Sorry, can I follow up and be a bit of a bother? Just one last question. Is it ever practically rational to doubt our epistemic sort of capacities when it comes to sort of our relationship with God. I might think of something like from Scripture in Genesis, the case of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and sort of maybe him doubting, well, did I really sort of hear or understand God in some sense? Can I really trust what I take my faculties to be sort of telling me in this sort of an instance? Because if he does sort of trust that he's heard God correctly, then it obviously does work its way out in a sense. And I'm wondering if there's like a sort of counterexample that might work its way out in connection to the sort of case that you've made.
Yeah, thanks. So the Abraham case is interesting in this regard. That's a really good one to bring up. I guess just keep in mind that in my particular my particular thesis is that the truth of the doctrine of original sin in the worst case scenario does not undermine the rationality of trusting your own intuitions. It doesn't entail that you must trust your own intuitions. You have to do some sorting, right? You have to decide whether or not this contrary, defeating reason that you have for whatever you think you ought to do or believe, sacrifice your son or whatever that is. You have to sort and determine for yourself, right, whether or not you think your intuitions are the ones which you ought to go with, or if you ought to go with this other reason that you have. And that's just a complicated process, right? And not one that can be worked out as a universal sort of generalizable quantifier. And so I take it that the Abraham case would just be one of those where it's not irrational for Abraham actually to trust God in this particular instance. And if Scripture is to be believed, then it was God speaking to him, and that ended up working well for him. But it also would not have been irrational for him to have gone the other way, necessarily. It depends on how he sorts the reasons that he has. So.
That's helpful. Interesting to think about more. So thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
Well, awesome. Thank you guys so much for the really thoughtful, interesting questions. And Jonathan, I just want to thank you so much for giving of your time to be here to share your paper and to answer all these questions today. Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate everyone coming here. And Jamie, I know she's already had to head out, but and Yvonne, great to meet both of you. I'm glad you're able to make it. Jason, Kevin, Joshua, good to see you. Always wonderful to see your happy faces. I hope everybody's doing well. So thanks again, Josh, for having me. Yeah, my pleasure. So I'm going to stop recording.